For decades, Tasha Mercedes Shelby has been proclaiming her innocence in the death of her 2-year-old stepson before somebody finally believed her. Her doctor, whose own testimony sent the young woman to prison for life. She was 25 years old, by the way. The former Mississippi State medical examiner, Dr. Leroy Reddick, R-I-D-D-I-C-K, 2017, he testified, and he said, "I made a mistake." Yet Tasha Shelby, still remains behind bars this morning in the Correctional Institute of the Central Mississippi. Her story mirrors uncounted others who have been convicted of a homicide crime alleging a child died of shaking baby syndrome. But advancing pediatric medicine now suggests that those kids may have died from medical conditions. Basically, is the more we looked into it, or the more the medical industry looked into it, there could possibly be something else other than what is labeled, and I don't think anybody reading all this material here has a complete and definitive explanation on shaken baby syndrome. No one shook this child, no one abused this child, said Valena Beety, and Valena will be joining us in a moment or two, Shelby's attorney. The jury was relying on the wrong information. Shelby's story begins in Biloxi, 1997. On June 1st of 97, Shelby was sleeping in her bedroom when there was a loud thump that awakened her. Matter of fact, let me switch over here because I've got the actual court records here. This is the Court of Appeal filing from the state of Mississippi, and I just want to mention, because this is not from a news reporter, this is coming from actually the case information. Case number and all of that, the judge, the jury, the attorneys, etc. And I'll read a little bit of this just to give you some background on our interview coming up in a moment or two. In 1997, 2-year-old Brian Thompson IV died of a result of multiple force injuries to his head, caused significant bleeding around his brain, massive swelling of the brain. Tasha Shelby, who was engaged to Brian's father, claimed that she was awakened by a big thump about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning and found Brian, the 2.5-year-old, lying on the floor of his bedroom. Shelby was the only adult at home at the time, and Shelby was indicted for capital murder. She was convicted and sentenced to imprisonment without parole following a jury trial, and the court affirmed her conviction and sentenced on appeal. 2015, Shelby filed a motion for post-conviction relief. It did not work out. In May of 97, Shelby and her then-fiancé, Brian Thompson III, were living together in Biloxi. They were with their newborn baby. They had a newborn baby. The newborn baby's name is Devon. Shelby's 3-year-old son, she had a 3-year-old son, and his name was Dakota, and then Thompson's 2.5-year-old son, Brian. About 7:30 p.m. on May the 29th, Thompson left to go to work. He worked at night. Shelby's grandmother, Honey Salk, and Salk's husband, Don, came over to Shelby's house about 8 p.m. to pick up Dakota for an overnight visit to their house, the other child, Dakota. The Salks stayed there for about an hour. And then Honey testified that Brian played happily. She saw Brian then. He was happy throughout their visit, and that she did not notice any marks or any bruises on him. And according to Shelby, the mother, she gave Brian a snack, put him to bed, and the Salks left, took Dakota with them. Shelby told the law enforcement that she was awakened by a big thump about 3:30 or 4 o'clock in the morning, and according to the mother, Shelby, she found Brian on the floor of the bedroom, and it appeared to be having seizures and was not breathing. She called her husband, Thompson, at work, told Brian that he wasn't breathing, that she could not get through to 911 operator. Thompson immediately returned home to find Shelby standing in the doorway holding the 2.5-year-old stepson, Brian. Thompson testified that Brian appeared, quote, pretty much lifeless and limp and blue as could be, end quote. Thompson laid his son on the floor, attempted to administer CPR. He then decided to take Brian to the hospital. When he asked Shelby whether they should call the hospital or 911, she said no. Thompson told Shelby to get Devon, that was the baby, so they could take Brian to the hospital. Thompson testified that he actually bumped Brian's head the 2.5-year-old child, who was unconscious, slightly on the door of the van as he put the child in the van. Thompson told Shelby to continue to try to administer CPR to Brian on the way. They did note later that he mentioned during testimony that the bump was slight, apparently not doing any additional damage, but we'll get into that and some other questions on this one. But the doctor, before he died, the pathologist, the forensic pathologist, basically said he made a mistake, but at this time, she stays in prison. What's the update on this? We will find out from these two ladies who are front and center on this mission. At 7:20, coming up next, Valena Beety. She's Deputy Director of the Academy for Justice, and also we'll have in the house Renee Moore-Smith. Valena Beety joins us. She is Deputy Director of the Academy for Justice, and also author of Manifesting Justice, Wrongly Convicted Women Reclaim Their Rights. And in the studio, it's Renee Moore-Smith. Ladies, good morning to both of you. Can you both hear me? Everything okay?
Yes.
This is called mic check thing. Valena, how are you?
I'm great, thank you.
You certainly, and thank you guys both for showing. This is such it's a big story. It's got a lot of moving parts. I'm reading it, and I can't decide one way or the other, and I'm not here to decide, but I want to hear the story. So I want you guys to kind of take us along on this one, and I do have some questions. But first of all, just any update, Valena, where we are today with this one and the story of Tasha Shelby.
Sure. So we are in court, in federal court in the Southern District of Mississippi, down on the coast. Mm-hmm. So we have a petition before a judge, but this could all change at any moment. The Attorney General could decide to commute her sentence. D.A. Parker on the coast in Harrison County could commute her sentence. And we've also filed a clemency petition to the governor who could grant her pardon or commute her to be eligible for parole and make it a decision for the parole board.
Renee, have you visited with her recently?
I see her occasionally. I first met her when I began my volunteer work 3 years ago. She was my Uber driver, and she shuttled me back and forth to my class on a golf cart. And it was just one of those chance encounters, and she just didn't look like she belonged to me.
All right, I need you to get a little bit closer to the microphone. Just manhandle it and just pull it to you some, if you don't mind. There we go. I can hear you a lot. But there we go.
Okay.
Thank you, ma'am. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering, first of all, Valena, for the people who don't know the story, just kind of recap it and take it from where I left it to where they were headed to the hospital. I think what happened was he was stopped by a police officer for speeding. The police officer heard him say that they had a child in there. The police officer tried to give the child CPR. They went to the hospital. Take it from there.
Multiple people tried to revive this child and did CPR on this child. And little Brian had a seizure. He fell out of his bed, and he couldn't breathe. He already had asthma, but he couldn't breathe. He couldn't get oxygen. So, again, multiple people are trying to revive this child. Took him to the hospital, and he couldn't be revived. And this was this 2.5-year-old child who tragically had these health conditions. But the prosecutors and the doctors thought that this child died from shaken baby syndrome, which wouldn't have been unusual for them to jump to that conclusion at the time. But now, 25 years later, this child tragically died in 1997. 25 years later, we know more about shaken baby syndrome. We know this child didn't die from shaking. And we also can finally look at the facts of this woman could not have done it. She was 4'9.5" tall. She's a little person. She'd just given birth to her daughter 2 weeks earlier and had tubal ligation surgery. This was simply not a baby. This child was 3 feet tall, over half her size, was 33 pounds, and he just didn't die from this. And it's not just us saying this. The doctor who testified against her at trial changed his opinion and now believes she didn't do this. The child wasn't killed, and he even changed the death certificate, which would be a criminal offense for him to falsify it.
Did in one of the stories that I read, Renee, was the fact that the child had been being treated for seizures. Then another one that I read said they had an appointment that was scheduled, I think the next day or a couple of days in advance before he died, for a doctor's appointment to look into those seizures. Which was it? Had he been diagnosed with those seizures yet or not?
Paul, I can't answer that.
Renee, Valena, do you know?
I can jump in here, yeah. So they had taken him to the doctor, and a lot of family members not only said this but testified at her trial that they had seen him having these petit mal seizures. And they took him to the pediatrician, and he had an appointment for a week later, and he just never made it to the appointment with the neurologist. So
how did he get those bruises? Because when you look at some of the testimony and some of the official transcript here, I mean, the guy was, the young fellow at 2.5 years old, he had some pretty good bruises on him, and he supposedly fell out of bed. The bed was no more than 10 or 15 inches up off the floor. Then a little bit later on, somebody came in and testified, well, maybe he could have been standing up. But speak to that.
I am so glad you asked about this, because photos were shown to the jury of what looked like bruises and were these large birthmarks known as Mongolian spots. And if you look at that and you're like, wow, that really looks like a bad bruise, but it wasn't. They were birthmarks. So that was part of it. And those were, I mean, really compelling photos if you don't know that they are Mongolian spots. And frankly, the dad had Mongolian spots too. Like, it's a genetic. It's not dangerous.
Well, but surely this was brought out at trial to delineate between the two, was it not?
Nope.
Well, that's crazy.
Told her attorneys, I know. She told her attorneys, she's like, "Hey, bring up the Mongolian spots," and they never did. So that never came up to the jury.
And let me go back to this, and I hate to interject with some questions here, but I know there's a lot that the audience is also asking. Honey Salk and her husband Don came over the night this happened, well, the night before, because it happened early in the morning at 3 or 4 o'clock. But they took one of the children on a sleepover, Dakota. They didn't notice anything there, as far as any bruises, anything else. So what you're saying is if those bruises were there then, those were the Mongolian spots you're talking about. And the parents or the grandparents wouldn't have thought anything about it.
Right, no,
Correct.
Of course not.
Okay.
I will say the child did fall out of the bed, and the father, in rushing the child to get to the car, hit the child's head on the car door. So there are like 2 bruises on the head, on the front and back, that make sense for that. But the others are, these alleged bruises on the body are these birthmarks.
Was she offered a plea deal?
That I don't know. I don't know that she ever was. She waited 3 years for trial. She waited 3 years for her trial.
Did she offer a polygraph, or was asked to take a polygraph?
She did talk to the police. She never said anything other than, this child, I came in, this child was having a seizure on the floor by his bed, and I immediately called the hospital, called my husband. She has said that every single time. The police notes say this too. She has never said anything different.
I do want to ask you this, because in the transcript, the official transcript itself, it says, however, when he asked, meaning the husband Thompson, when Thompson asked Shelby whether they should call the hospital or 911, she said no. But the way that's written in here, it seems to be something indictable, but she could have possibly said, no, I don't want to call them, let's go there. So I don't know how to interpret that.
So she had already called the hospital, because remember, she had just been released from this hospital. She had a very difficult pregnancy. She'd been going there regularly, and she had stayed in the hospital for 3 days after giving birth and having this C-section and surgery. So she knew that number by heart. She called them immediately, and they said, don't wait for the ambulance. Come in right now. She called her husband. He comes home. They jump in the car. So that's, they just were on the move. And that's why the dad was feeding. Like you said, the police stopped them, and they're like, no, we can't stop. We have to go to the hospital.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to take a quick break here because Shelby was indicted for capital felony murder for killing the 2.5-year-old during the commission of a felony child abuse. Her case proceeded to trial in 2000. There was an appeal process. We'll go through that also with Renee Moore-Smith and also Valena Beety, who are tracking this, and we'll tell you more about it coming up next. We're back live in the Trustmark Studios, and I thank you, Valena Beety. She is the Deputy Director of the Academy for Justice and also author of Manifesting Justice, Wrongly Convicted Women Reclaim Their Right. And in the studio, it's Renee Moore-Smith, who is a volunteer and has done a lot of work over with, I guess, the correctional facilities in the state. Just go over visiting, and what does a volunteer do there?
I have a sewing ministry at CMCL.
Very good.
And
very good.
We do a lot of community work, community service work, and it helps to turn the hearts of the inmates and give them an opportunity to give back. So it's a really...
The forensics the forensic pathologist on this, the doctor, the one in question, he passed away when? A couple of years ago? Or when was that he passed away?
It was last year, I believe.
Last year. Dr. Leroy Reddick performed the autopsy and concluded the cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. The manner of death was ruled a homicide, and she was indicted for capital felony murder. Valena, I want to ask you this, is what happened during the appeal process? Because this came after his admission that he had made a mistake and said that it was not a homicide, it was accidental. Take us to that part of it. And you would think that this was been an open and closed case here, but take us through that. Can you hear me?
I don't...
Perez, is she still there?
Yes, I am still here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Great. So, we not only had Dr. Riddick, we had other scientists and scientific experts and doctors who also testified that this wasn't a shaken baby syndrome death, and that this child died accidentally from having these seizures and having this shortfall. And that was all presented to a trial judge down in Harrison County. But he ultimately decided that he didn't think that evidence would convince a jury to come to a different result. He didn't think there was enough evidence there. And now we've talked to some of those jurors who have said they would not have voted to convict if they had known about Dr. Riddick's changed opinion.
Yeah, I'm interested in. I'm just fascinated that he wouldn't at least understand or weigh the weight of the doctor actually saying that he thought it was accidental. That did not matter to him, or he just felt like maybe the jury wouldn't buy it.
I think the latter. He just found that Dr. Riddick's testimony at trial was very convincing, and nothing had changed his mind about that. He just wasn't convinced that he should take that big step, because it's a very big step to reverse a conviction. It is so difficult to reverse a conviction. So
Yeah.
we're talking about something very, very big here, and he just wasn't ready to make that step.
This whole thing is about probably 30 or 40 pages long, and I noticed somewhere in there reading this last night, at one point, Dr. Reddick said something about the injuries could have happened during an accident on the way to the hospital, but there was no accident. So did that kind of mar the reputation or some of the testimony of the doctor?
It did. So we did a deposition of Dr. Riddick before the hearing where we were talking to him and the prosecutors were talking to him, and no one had talked to him before about this case. Like, we hadn't talked with him and sat down and been like, what do you think? And I thought the prosecution was going to do that, but the prosecution hadn't sat down with him, been like, so what do you think? So he shows up, and he'd looked at his whole case file, and this child had a car accident about a year earlier, and so he conflated that in that moment. But by the time we were before the trial judge, he had reviewed everything, and he was very clear, without even thinking about that car accident, he was very clear that this child's death was not a murder.
Is Honey the mother or the mother-in-law? I was a little confused on that one.
That's the grandmother. It's,
Their grandmother, okay. She mentioned in here 4 weeks prior to Brian's death, and this is mentioned in this deposition more than once. She noticed the bottom portion of the whites of his eyes were blood red, but this was something that was happening over a period of weeks or maybe even months. That related to maybe the seizures themselves. Was that taken into consideration, or some validation that this child had some aneurysm problems prior to this?
She testified about that before the jury, and the dad also briefly said, yes, this child had been having these petit mal seizures, but if you ask the jurors, they don't remember any of that. What they remember is both the defense and the prosecution agreed and put on experts that said this child died from shaking and from shaken baby syndrome. That's what they remember. And that was the key argument, but that's how this child died. And the defense was simply saying, yeah, the child died from shaking, but it was someone else. It wasn't Tasha.
Yeah. Has she talked to you about this, Renee? Has she anything that we don't know about this that she's spoken to you about?
Well, I know her on a personal level because I'm a volunteer there. And one thing that I can share is that she's still very emotional about it. She says, I haven't even had time to grieve the loss of my stepson. Everyone's been busy pointing the finger at me about something that I didn't do. And if anyone were to meet Tasha, you see this bright light, and that is not what you normally see inside the prison. There's just a sweetness, there's an innocence about her. And as far as details of the case, we haven't talked other than her just telling me I didn't do it. And I've done a lot of research myself. I was so intrigued by, after I met her, I just decided to look into the case. I didn't know Valena. I didn't know anyone. I was just curious. And so when I dug into it, I was just shocked. Just the her being 4'9" and the baby weighing 33 pounds, and them saying that she violently shook him to death. It just doesn't. That alone is a lot. But I went to the Attorney General's office. I laid out the case there. I've written to them for a year. I've had no response.
And you're just asking for a new trial?
Just asking for them to look into it. Yeah. I mean, it's.
I don't want to spend a lot of time on one subject here because we're going to be out of time. Let me ask Valena this: when you look at the manner of the injuries that ultimately caused death, and it's only 16 inches from the top of his bed or the mattress itself, 16 inches to the floor, and the floor is carpeted. I think they said it had shag carpeting. Does that put some doubt in your mind how those injuries could have happened at just 16 inches, even if you're standing up? Or do you believe that those injuries correspond to what actually happened?
It's a combination of things for this child. I mean, would my child have had, a death? Would my child have died from that kind of fall? Maybe not. We do know that those falls cause injuries, but this child was particularly susceptible. This child had a seizure disorder, had asthma, and so that kind of fall combined with having this seizure and having difficulty breathing already, this child wasn't getting oxygen. And even though Tasha did CPR, her husband came home and did CPR. In the car, the police jumped in and did CPR. Everyone's trying to revive this child, and he's just not able to get oxygen.
Dr. Kenneth, is it Monsoon or Monson? I'm not sure. Testified. Monson. Yeah. Testified for Shelby as an expert in the field of biochemical engineering, and testified that literature shows that these children are very seldom injured seriously from a household fall. But speak to that, exactly what he said and how that came out.
Yeah, so at the time of trial, we didn't think that short falls could cause really damage to children. And now we know that children can tragically die from short falls. Now, that's particularly important where we have a child who already has this seizure disorder and is already fragile, frankly. So here, it's really, you have to look at all of it, that there was this shortfall as well as the seizure happening for this child. And, you know, he also testified about how a woman who was Tasha's size just could not have shaken a 2.5-year-old child who weighed 33 pounds, could not have shaken that child hard enough to have caused these kinds of injuries and to cause the brain injuries. And now we know, again, that lack of oxygen, a bump on the head, can cause some of these brain injuries that we're seeing.
Has in any of this deliberations or speaking with her, she's open to a polygraph test now? This far out, I'm not sure.
Oh, absolutely.
She has offered that?
One before.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
let me do this. Let me pause for this one, and we'll get back with you guys with final thoughts when we come back in just a moment. Valena Beety, she is Deputy Director of the Academy for Justice, and also Renee Moore-Smith. And the final segment here, I just wanted to ask you, how long has she been in prison now, Renee?
22 years.
She's been in prison for 22 years. So that means her newborn is 22 years old, 22, 23, and also she had a 3-year-old, Dakota.
Right. So he's 26 or so.
Got it. All right, final thoughts. And I just want to say this, that it seems to be a little bit in this whole thing where a judge would say, I don't know if I want to take up my time and go through this process because I don't think the jury would weigh this evidence. But it seems like the doctor, the forensic pathologist, who actually changed it from homicide
to accident
to an accident would outweigh that to the point of even if it's a 1% chance that this woman is not guilty.
When that was the one piece of evidence that convicted her.
Yeah. Final thoughts from you, Renee.
Paul, we're looking for a pathway to freedom. I mean, we're just, there's so many options that could happen, but, you know, obviously clemency would be wonderful to have a pardon, but if not, just a commutation of her to parole eligibility. She's maintained her innocence all the way through, and now she's looking at him. She's close to 50, and she just needs to come home. So, you know, we're just trying to get someone to listen to us, to talk to us. It's a complicated case, obviously, but we need help.
Valena, let me get to the final thoughts of Valena. And I know that this is one of the things that you do in the book Manifesting Justice. Is this case probably one of the top 3 that you've worked on, or is it just normal what's going on out there?
It's absolutely one of the most important cases I've worked on, and it's been shocking to me that with all the evidence of her innocence that she's still in prison. Shocking. And on top of that, Paul, she has a perfect record in prison. She hasn't had a write-up since 2004. She had no prior criminal record before she came into prison, and yet she's still there, and she's going to be there for the rest of her life until someone steps in to do something.
Let me ask both of you, is there anything on record as far as Biloxi and the authorities in that area of child services being called to that home for any reason at all prior to this?
Well, there was, I won't go into it too much, but there was a child custody dispute between Big Brian, the biological father, and the biological mother. So there was something going back and forth between the two of them. But not for Tasha. I mean, Tasha had not been really involved in those proceedings at all.
Okay, your final thoughts on this. Where do we go from here?
Where we go here is D.A. Crosby Parker agrees to dismiss the charges against her or commute her sentence to time served. The governor turns it over to the parole board to immediately make a decision about parole or grant her a pardon. And, you know, the attorney general can also step in here and say, we're dismissing these charges. We are letting this woman go home.
We have a double murderer who's going to be paroled. And that's in the works, and we talked about this not too long ago. This is the the differences between these two cases is amazing how out of whack things are, but it is stunning.
And
ladies,
Paul, if you wanted her to come live on your show and do a polygraph, she would. Like, she has said the same thing for all of these years, for decades, and she just needs someone to listen to her.
Listen, ladies, I thank you so very, very much. If there are any updates, please let us know. I'd love to get you back on the air. Okay?
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you.
You got it.